We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. Thank you for attending The Power of Investing to Change the World. We're excited to bring back a special guest tonight for the third time this month, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. Many of you know who I am, but for those who we haven't yet met, my name is Joe Bilello, CEO, founder of Avanti Wealth Management. My team and I have been helping clients gain clarity and confidence in their planning and in their investment decisions for over 30 years. As I said, we have a special guest. We're honored to have Jason Meyer, co-founder, managing partner of Eventide Asset Management, back with us tonight. And he's going to help us answer the question, is there more to investing than making money? Sounds like a crazy question, doesn't it? Those of you who are already part of our Avanti family might recognize Eventide and the value that they've added not only to your portfolios, but also to the world in which we live. For everyone watching tonight, we'll enter you in for a drawing for one of several Eventide insulated mugs. They're really nice mugs. We have quite a few. So I think if everybody stays on, we might have enough for you all. So it'd be a big drawing. As a reminder, for compliance purposes, this webinar is educational in nature, not a recommendation to buy or sell a security. We do like to keep the compliance people happy. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We'll enter as many as we can at the end of Jason's presentation. With that being said, let me turn it over to Jason.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's good to be back for a third time. I think you're gonna have to put me on the payroll if we keep doing these together.
Independent contractor status only. So.
That's right. So no, this is great. I've enjoyed my time doing these with you. Just want to say a warm hello to all of you who are joining in for this webinar. This is a topic that I think you will find to be really exciting. We're talking about the power that investing has to change the world around us. And before diving in, I'll just do a self-introduction. I'm Jason, good to meet you. I'm a managing partner of a company called Eventide. We're an asset manager that's based in Boston. We're one of the asset managers that Joe works with in helping clients save for the future. Our specialty is values-based investing. You'll know all about that by the end of this evening. My day-to-day work is in the area of advocacy, where, simple way to put it, I'm an advocate for values-based investing. And with that, we will begin. So how do we change the world? This is a big, grand topic. I know there's probably a lot of thoughts about this. We can't have an open discussion in this format, so I'm going to lay out a case, and I'm going to make a couple of controversial statements here at the start, but hang with me. The first way that we can get at how the world changes is by answering the question, how does the world not change? And ruling out a couple of possibilities. I'm going to make the case that the world does not change primarily through politics. A lot of us put our hope in politics. There was a tremendous amount of anxiety about the last presidential election, for example. It seemed like the world's fate was hanging in the balance. But if you think about it, politicians, at least here in the US, they have to have their finger up into the wind. They have to be reading which way the winds are blowing. They have to operate in harmony with those winds. Very difficult for them to go against those prevailing winds. And if they do, their job is at stake. And so they're hired to enact ideas that have been in circulation for a while, that are already popularly embraced. And so they're much more a go with the flow servant of the people, okay? The next group that does not fundamentally change the world is individuals working alone. We tend to remember heroic individuals in history. So if you think about William Wilberforce, for example, certainly that individual changed the world. But if you're a student of history and you've read about Wilberforce or anyone else, you realize there's a lot more forces at play. So what I've just said, these are not my own thoughts. These are the thoughts of this man, James Davison Hunter. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. I think he's the leading thinker on how the world changes. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to pick up his book, which is listed there. So how does the world change? I want to read you a quote from him, and this will frame up my comments. This capacity to change the world is not evenly distributed in a society. It's concentrated in certain institutions and among certain leadership groups who have a lopsided access to the means of cultural production. Institutions, he argues, are one of the main ways that the world changes. So you can think about the institutions of Hollywood, for example, or the institutions of higher education like Harvard, or the institutions of influential news media. So think about the newspapers that have a lot of influence, like the New York Times, for example. These institutions hold disproportionate power to shape our world. And what I want to try to convince you of is that investing is one of these institutions of power. In fact, I think it's one of the most powerful. And I'm going to try to convince you of this by showing you this power in history. And then I want to jump to the present day and actually talk about how we can harness this power in the way we make investment decisions. So for my first historical example, I want to talk about the man on the screen. So take a look at this picture. Go back to your middle school history days and see if you remember who this is. A very famous explorer. This is Christopher Columbus, who set sail on one of the most famous voyages of all time. And we all know it, right? He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But what a lot of us don't know is actually the investing story behind the journey. What Columbus wanted to do was to access a new trading route with Japan, China, and India by sailing west off of Europe. He had done some calculations and figured Japan was 3,000 miles west off of Europe. He was obviously dead wrong about that, but nevertheless, that's what he believed. And he wanted to start a business to establish this shipping route. Problem was very risky, right? No one had ever done this before. You could sail off into the sunset, never to return. Very expensive. This would have been in the tens of millions of dollars in today's capital. And he had trouble finding investors. In fact, he had to go all over Europe trying to find people to back him in this new company. He started in Italy, where he was from, and was turned down by investors there. He went to France. No way. He went to England. No. Finally, he was about to give up. He finally heard a yes from Spanish investors. And maybe you remember the story of Ferdinand and Isabella. By the way, he struck a very sophisticated deal with these investors. He negotiated the right to get 10% revenues from this trading route and an option to invest up to 1/8 in any business that would be established in lands that he would claim for Spain. So make no mistake about it. This was a for-profit business backed by investors. This is what investing used to be like. It's kind of weird to think about it that way. Now, we all know what happened. He did not find Japan. He ended up finding Central America, landed in the Bahamas there. But what I want you to think about is the world change implications of investors. I don't know if you've ever thought about why Central America speaks Spanish, or why the major religion of that whole territory is Roman Catholic, or why their diet consists of things like tortillas instead of things like croissants. The answers to these questions lie with investors. Because Spanish investors backed Columbus, he sailed under the Spanish flag. He carried with him Spanish interest into the new territory. This is what determined the language, Spanish after Spain. The religion, Roman Catholic, Spain is Roman Catholic. Things like tortillas, diet, culture, all that comes from Spain. And it could have gone a different way, right? I told you he went all over Europe. If England had backed him, kind of weird to think about, but Central America would speak English. It would be a Protestant area, Anglican, and it would look like British society. It could have gone a different way. It was actually investors who changed the world here. I know this is a new way to think. I'm going to give you another example of this. This is the map of the trading routes of the British India Company in red and the Dutch East India Company in yellow. These are shipping companies, just like Columbus. These companies were established in 1600 and 1602, respectively. Economic historians will tell you that the world of modern investing was born out of the shipping industry, primarily in the 1600s. These two companies, in distinction, are the first two truly modern corporations that we have. What makes them modern? They raised the capital that they needed to start their businesses by issuing stocks and bonds to ordinary investors, the first time that had ever been done. And we get the world's first stock exchange, as a matter of fact, in Amsterdam, where people could then trade these stocks and bonds with one another on a secondary market in order to gain liquidity back on those investments. Now, did these two companies change the world? Yes, they did. In the case of the British India Company, India becomes a colony of Britain under the influence of this one company. This is why, to this day, although not a lot of people know this, the official language of India is, drum roll, can you guess? It's English. You can look it up. They have the second largest English-speaking population in the world. If you count those who speak English as a second language, they're number one in the world for speaking English. How in the world did that happen? The British India Company and the investors who backed them. And if you know anything about Indian history, from the railroad to the university to the political structures, all of that is the legacy of this one company. What about the Dutch East India Company? They got started in 1602. By the year 1634, they had achieved a company value in today's dollars of 8.2 trillion with a T. You might be wondering, how does that compare with big companies today? It dwarfs them. This is the answer to the trivia question. What is the most valuable company that's ever existed? It is the Dutch East India Company. And as a result of that scale, they had massive influence and impact all over Southeast Asia. Who caused that impact? The investors who caught a vision for what this company was capable of. Now, were these investors world changers? Probably not. They were probably ordinary investors like you and me, just looking to grow their money. Nevertheless, investing holds this power. So the world of investing is often running in the 1600s, and it should not surprise us that abuse soon followed. And one of the people that would comment on the abuses, someone you probably recognize, Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. Here's what he had to say about investing in his day. You can see the date now, we're in 1697. He said this: investing has raised the fancies of credulous people to such a height that merely on the shadow of expectation, they formed companies, chose committees, appointed officers, shares books, raised great stocks, and cried up an empty notion to that degree that people have been betrayed to part with their money for shares in a new nothing. And when the inventors have carried on the jest till they've sold all their own interest, they leave the cloud to vanish of itself, and the poor purchasers to quarrel with one another, to go to law about settlements, transferrings, some bone or other thrown among them by the subtlety of the author, to lay blame of the miscarriage upon themselves. Thus the shares at first begin to fall by degrees, and happy is he who sells in time, till like brass money, it will go at last for nothing at all. I'm really glad we don't talk like this anymore. This is incredibly dense, complicated language. I hope you were able to get a sense for what he was saying. I'm going to explain it. He basically is saying everyone's really excited about investing. There's all these new companies, all these new stocks and bonds. People are buying everything that's coming out, hoping to get rich. Unscrupulous businesses are watching this from the sidelines and decide to enter in and really just launch businesses with the purpose of stealing people's money and then to disappear into the ether. It was a very, very risky time for investors. It was a very unethical time in the world of business and the economy. And so what was needed at this time was for somebody to come along and to bring an ethical vision for the practice of business and investing. And the person that would do that is a man named John Wesley. John Wesley was a Christian minister in England in the 1700s. You may recognize him. He founded what we call the Methodist movement in Christianity. And here is his most famous quote, which is a good summary of his philosophy. He said this: "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can." Isn't that beautiful? It's one of my favorite quotes. Well, John Wesley was looking at all of the mess of investing and decided to bring this "do all the good you can" philosophy to bear on investing. And he did this by preaching a very practical sermon to his congregation in the year 1759, entitled "The Use of Money." And I'm going to share a passage from this sermon. It's kind of long, but I'm going to just highlight a couple of points in it. Here's what he said: "We are thirdly to gain all we can without hurting our neighbor." So he was not opposed to making money. He says, hey, gain all we can, as long as we're not hurting our neighbor. He says, "This we may not, cannot do if we love our neighbor as ourselves. We cannot, if we love everyone as ourselves, hurt anyone in his substance. And he goes on to describe various businesses and investments in his day that he felt like were predicated on harming our neighbor. And then I'm going to skip to the end of the quote here, if you can see my mouse. Last couple sentences, he says this, and I'm going to expound on him a little bit for clarity. He says, if the profits we make come from business activities that profit or benefit the souls of men, you're clear. Your employment's good, your gain is innocent. But if the profits come from activities that are either sinful in themselves, remember he was a Christian minister, or natural inlets to sin of various kinds, then it is to be feared. You have a sad account to make. Oh, beware, lest God say in that day, these have perished in their iniquity, but their blood do I require at thy hands. Wow, right? Strong, strong language. He is raising the stakes on investing considerably. He's saying, hey, look, I know you're investing for the purpose of getting a profit, but what is on the other side of that profit? Does it benefit our neighbor or does it harm our neighbor? And he's reminding his congregation of their commitment to love their neighbor in every aspect of life, including how they're using their money and investing. By connecting investing to an impact on our neighbor, he's fundamentally making this kind of world change argument that investing has. If we talk about investing today, we're dealing with Google, Facebook, Twitter, Netflix. Hopefully you'll agree with me. These are all examples of companies that have changed the world. And they would not exist without investors. First, venture capital investors, then an initial public offering, pushed higher in the secondary market. I don't want to make a value judgment one way or another against or for these companies. I'm simply trying to illustrate how powerful investing is. It indeed does shape the world around us. Let me give you one other example from history that I think is pretty incredible. So back in 1971, Christians, as well as many others based in the US, were very concerned about apartheid. Now, if you're fuzzy on apartheid, I'll give you a refresher here. So the word apartheid comes from a language in South Africa, from the Afrikaans. And the word means separation. You can translate apartheid literally as aparthood, or to keep separate. And it described an institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa in that day, where the local Black population was kept separate from the white population. And besides that, were treated in a very inferior manner. And so there were a lot of people in the US who were looking at this from afar and wanted to see it end. I mentioned how politics can sometimes be impotent, and I think this is an example. The South African government had already ignored multiple United Nations sanctions and embargoes. So the United Nations, all these other nations are trying to put pressure on South Africa to end apartheid. South Africa is saying, who cares? Fine us all you want, leave us alone. So what do? Let's say you wanted to change this. Politics isn't working. You're based in the US. What do? Well, a group of Episcopals decided to take up the power of investing to change the world. So the Episcopal Church was examining their investments, and they realized that they were investors in General Motors, the automotive company. And General Motors had operations in South Africa. So they put two and two together. They said, wait a minute, we're the owner of this company. We don't want to be participating in apartheid. So let's write a formal letter to General Motors as shareholders, asking General Motors to change their practices with respect to these segregation practices they had. That's what they did. This is the first example of what we call shareholder advocacy in history. And to write this letter, they employed the help of this man. This is Leon Sullivan. You can see he was a Black man, a Baptist minister and an anti-apartheid activist. So he had grown up under a segregated US under Jim Crow, had experienced discrimination personally earlier in his life, growing up in Philadelphia. He became very passionate about the cause of ending apartheid. And so he worked with these Episcopals, and they came up with what they called the Sullivan Principles, named after Leon Sullivan, a set of specific proposals for General Motors. It was things like, General Motors, you need to have equal pay for equal work. Same working conditions for blacks and whites. You need to integrate your bathrooms and your water fountains. Those were segregated. Things like that. They proposed this to General Motors in this formal letter, and General Motors decides to adopt it. And incredibly, they bring Leon Sullivan, this Baptist minister, onto the board of General Motors to help give them guidance. Then guess what happens? Ford and Goodyear, two other automotive companies with operations in South Africa, they're looking at GM, watching what GM is doing. They said, hey, we should do that too. So they adopt the Sullivan principles, and one by one by one, like dominoes, companies adopt these principles. It catalyzes a more widespread change in culture. In fact, history remembers that one of the key instruments in the fall of apartheid was actually started by this investor pressure. By the way, these investors, they were ordinary investors. They owned 0.006% of the outstanding shares in GM. They were not some big financial institution throwing their weight around. They had a vanishingly small interest in the company. They simply used investing with intention. Pretty cool, I think. So hopefully this is enough to at least get you thinking. And I want to talk about how we can use this power. How can we do this successfully? A few comments. Number one, we have to be intentional. If we just invest in the status quo, we will reap the status quo. So if you want to see the world look any different, you have to engage with investing in a different way. Number two, you have to work with others. No one of us with our IRA or our 401k is going to make a dent in a world of trillions of dollars. But if we work together, working in collaboration, we have a lot more force. And finally, we need tools. We need ways to put intention and collaboration into action. That's what my company does, Eventide. We're an investment product. That's what Joe does with his investment advice practice by introducing clients to these ideas. There's lots of others out there. Now, what do we mean by intentionality? Sounds good, but it also sounds a little vague. Well, there are three ways you can be intentional. Number one, you can choose to avoid investing in companies that have problems. So this might be avoiding companies because of connections to tobacco or pornography or gambling. There's a whole set of things there. This is fundamentally what John Wesley was describing, avoiding investing in companies that we believe harm our neighbor. The next is to embrace. You can actually seek out and positively invest in companies for the good things they're doing in the world. I'm going to give you some examples of that. And we can engage companies just like the Episcopals did with General Motors in apartheid. What I want to do here at the end is give you three examples of what I think are some good things going on in the world of investing that I think we can be all excited to participate in. These are themes that are part of my own investments or my company's own investments. These are examples that are familiar to me, but there are many. The first one is in the area of clean energy. And I want to give you a little bit of a different take on clean energy here. So I want to read you some headlines from India. India's pollution today is as deadly as the black smog that covered Britain during the Industrial Revolution. New Delhi's gas chamber smog is so bad that United Airlines has stopped flying there. Look at this last one. Breathing in Delhi air is equivalent to smoking 44 cigarettes a day. I don't know if you've been to some of the big cities in India. If you have, you know exactly what this is describing. You've experienced it firsthand. I'm going to show you some images. All these images depict smog. This is not a foggy day. This is what it looks like every day. This is in New Delhi. This is a famous arch in New Delhi called the India Gate here in the background. I'll show you Beijing. This is one of the worst places in the world for smog. This is the same image left and right. On the left, a heavy rain's just come through, washing away the smog temporarily. On the right is what it looks like on a typical day. This is the Forbidden City in Beijing. You can see the brown tinge to the air. Another picture of Beijing, not at night. Here in the foreground, we see face masks. Boy, isn't that familiar? But here there's no coronavirus. These photos were taken long before that. These people are not trying to prevent contracting a virus. They are trying to breathe cleaner air. This is a very common practice to wear a mask when you go outside in the big cities in India and China. It starts when you're a child, and you have every expectation of wearing a mask outside for the rest of your life. I can't imagine. That would be horrible. I'm very sick of masks. One more from Beijing. So this kind of ordinary pollution that I just showed you in places like New Delhi and Beijing, it accounts for actually 16% of all premature deaths worldwide. You can see that's actually 9 million lives lost. It exceeds tobacco smoking, road fatalities, drug overdoses, every kind of violence in the world. This is the same data, but showing you the type of pollution. So you can see air is blue, what we've been describing. And the chart is very helpful in that it breaks out the problem by the wealth of nations. So you can see low income countries, lower middle income countries, upper middle and high income countries. So where are we? Right here. We have the lowest incidence of death due to these issues in the world. We walk outside, we take a deep breath, we say, it's a beautiful day. And indeed it is. I think one of the mistakes, though, that we can make is assuming that our quality of air is the same as others experience. I showed you that it is very different in places like India and China, where just breathing in that air causes a lot of health consequences, including this is showing mortality here. We can make a difference in places like India and China, though, through clean energy. I want to read you a quote here. You can try to guess who said it. I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. I wish I had more years left. I usually ask people in a live audience who they think said this. And everyone says Elon Musk or Al Gore or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, people like that. They always name a contemporary figure. You might be surprised, Thomas Edison back in 1931. What we're doing today with clean energy is actually, I think, a pretty amazing innovation and a dream, really, of inventors for a very long time. You're taking the power of the sun and converting that into energy without the immediate pollution there that I showed you is often caused. So pretty cool, I think. And coronavirus gave us a glimpse of what impacting India would look like. I want to show you that. So this is that India gate. This is what I showed you earlier, November 2019. This is what it looked like during the economic slowdown due to coronavirus. There was no heavy rain that came through. The air just cleared up. Beautiful blue skies. I would much rather live in the world on the right. And that's what our investments are seeking to accomplish through investments in clean energy, really meeting this basic need. I'm going to give you another one here. This one's pretty amazing. Water technology. More than 2,000 children die every day from water-related illness. We're going to be talking about water, so we need a working definition. This is the global definition for what it means to have access to water. I think this is useful to know. It means that there is a source of water within a kilometer of your location where you're able to obtain at least 20 liters of clean water for everybody that lives in your house. So how much is 20 liters? We don't really think in terms of liters. If you took a shower today and you are a typical American, you used 65 liters in that one shower. Here we're talking about 20, so this is quite a bit less water. And not just for showering, but you can see down here, all domestic purposes, including drinking, cooking, as well as personal hygiene. So this is a lot less water than you and I would use. But this is what it means to have access. Now, how big of a problem is water today? About 1 million people die each year from diarrhea due to water-related illness. 80% are children under the age of 5. Dirty water is actually the second largest killer of children in the world to this day. By 2025, how many people will not have access? That access definition we looked at. 800 million people, huge number. 133 million people have high-intensity worm infections in their gut. Half the schools of the world don't have clean water. An investment in clean water has a big return for society. Why is that? Because people are not sick. They're not on the toilet. They're not in the hospital. The healthcare system is less burdened. They're out being a productive member in society and contributing economically. So if you add up all of those positive benefits, there's actually a big return for the world. This is Finney Curavella. He's my colleague. He works at Eventide. He's our chief investment officer. These are 3 of his boys. He has 8 kids. Every year he goes to Uganda for church reasons. And while he's there, he tries to meet a practical need. Before becoming an investor, he was a medical doctor in Boston hospitals. And so he conducts what's called a deworming clinic. All of these people are lined up to be dewormed. The lines go on all day. There's no way he can see everybody in the area who has worms. Basically, everyone in Uganda has this critter living in their gut. This is Bilharzia. It's a worm. You get it from drinking contaminated water. It is treatable, fortunately. But if you think about it, you're really giving someone such a temporary fix, because if they go home and they drink contaminated water, which is how they got it in the first place, it is soon to return. In most of the world, water is considered women's work. And the reason that this is important to mention is that young girls are therefore not able to go to school because they're so preoccupied with the task of fetching water for the family. It is very involved and long, and it's a daily pressing need. And parts of the world are reaching crisis levels. Look at this well in Gujarat, India. That's a lot of people trying to get a very little amount of water. And so unsurprisingly, fights break out. These are 2 women in Pune fighting over water. You can see the water splashing there. They say, we face acute shortages of water, but water is available only 2 to 3 hours a day. Frequent fights. Need to walk 20 to 30 minutes to fetch water. It's so humiliating. We are not so advanced globally as we often assume. How do we fix this? Well, the world has a ton of water. The problem is most of that water is locked up in the ocean, where it's salt water, or in glaciers and ice caps, where it's frozen, or it's underground, where it's locked away. And if we actually look at the amount of surface water available for human consumption and get down to things like rivers and lakes, it's vanishingly small. You can see that because this is a blow up of that little sliver, and then all of this is a blow up of that little sliver. But what this chart also reveals is that if we could use infrastructure and technology backed by investment to access water that is locked up underground, for example, that would be a great way to try to address this need. So what we decided to do was to invest in what we think is the world leader in water technology, not just in the developed world, Americas and in Europe, but in the developing world. And this is by design. They have a 2025 goal to provide clean water to at least 20 million people living at the very base of the global economic pyramid. In other words, the poorest of the poor. This is a publicly traded company. Pretty admirable to see. You're used to seeing this on like a water nonprofit website. This is a for-profit business. This is matched by substantial volunteering and donation, more than 110,000 employee hours given away to clean water projects, more than 25 million given away in financial donations since 2010. And this is on top of this stated goal that the company has that they're working on in the developing world. So I think a really admirable company here in the way that they operate. Let me give you one last example. An unmet need in healthcare in the central nervous system. So I want you to think for a moment about the disease schizophrenia and try to bring to mind what this disease is. What do you know about it? We've all heard of it, but what is it? Kind of hard to define. And the reason for that is that it is known by actually a collection of symptoms, which are depicted here in this artwork. There are 2 categories of symptoms called positive and negative symptoms. The hallmarks are delusions and hallucinations. So people will see things, they'll hear things, they'll describe that the wall is talking to them. And often what they tell you they see and hear is really dark in nature. They'll have disorganized speech. They have a flat affect, which means they lack the wide emotional range that you and I have. They'll have reduced speech, and then they lack initiative. Just can't get motivated. Anyone come to mind? Have you met anyone who suffers from schizophrenia? If your mind went to the homeless, you would actually be correct. Schizophrenia is a vast problem among the homeless. In fact, it's one of the main drivers for homelessness in the world. And if you look at these symptoms, it's easy to see why that would be the case. Very difficult to hold down a job, to bring your best self to work. The stats on schizophrenia are actually quite staggering. About 3 million Americans suffer from schizophrenia. It's a lot bigger than I originally assumed when I first learned about this problem. Treatments we have are ancient, they barely work, and they have horrible side effects. The last FDA-approved treatment for schizophrenia was the year 1952, if you can believe it. That is just ancient in today's standards. It barely works. It has horrible side effects. It causes involuntary body contortions. So people will twist and writhe. So they'll say, hey, the cure is worse than the disease. So they won't take it. The World Health Organization ranks it as the third most debilitating disease in the world. If you suffer from schizophrenia, it's like being imprisoned in your central nervous system. So another huge problem here, and one that we've been very eager to try to address. There's not been much in this space, but a company we invested in the past approached us with a new idea for schizophrenia. They were working on a new treatment. And so we were very eager to hear about that. They showed us the medical literature. They described how the mechanism of action worked in this therapy. We do a lot of healthcare investing. I mentioned Finney's an MD, PhD, a doctor in his past. So we do a lot of healthcare investing. We took all that information in, put it through our gauntlet of tests, decided to invest. And I want to describe to you their clinical trial. So they took a group of patients that suffered from schizophrenia. They split them up into 2 equal groups, 50-50, and half the group got a placebo, which is nothing. And the other half got this new treatment that they had developed. They admitted everyone, to the hospital for a period of time and then monitored their symptoms. And I want to show you the results of this clinical trial. So on the x-axis down here, what we're looking at is just the length of stay in the hospital. So it was a 5-week stay. The baseline is day 0. On the vertical axis, it looks really scary, but it's actually really simple. If you see this PANSS, what that stands for is positive and negative symptoms score. I showed you those positive and negative symptoms. So all they're doing is just counting up how many symptoms a person is expressing, how severe those symptoms are, and calculating a number. This is the way that people gauge the severity of schizophrenia. You want to see it get better over these 5 weeks, which is why it starts at 0 and goes negative. Okay, so you want to see the line go down and to the right. The black dotted line shows you what happened with the placebo. You might be thinking, why did that get 5 points better? Because it's such a debilitating disease that just being in a hospital with regular care and meals and nurses and doctors, you get a little bit better. And this was totally expected. This was something that they already knew. So no surprise there. But look what happened with their treatment. They saw a more than 15-point, almost 20-point reduction in this PANSS score, which clinicians told us is a game changer. It would change someone's life suffering from schizophrenia. So this was incredibly exciting. And side effects, which are terrible on the old medicine, here appear to be very mild. And the way that you can tell is in a clinical trial, you just want to look at how many people say they want to leave the trial and leave the trial. And if you look at how many people are getting the drug versus the placebo, which is nothing, if there's a lot of people leaving that are on the drug, it tells you something, right? It tells you something about side effects there. So 20% of patients discontinued the trial that were on the drug, but 21% on the placebo. So no difference there. So whatever the side effects may be, they appear to be very mild. So in totality, this is really exciting. Now there's one more phase of a phase 3 trial they have to go through before the FDA could approve it. We're very optimistic based on the strength of this data here. And we're investors, we're hoping for a good result. But what about the story, right? It's stories like these that we describe as investing that makes the world rejoice. You have choices when you invest, where you invest your money. And what we're trying to do with what I'm describing in this philosophy is investing your money so that you can grow it by investing in companies that are a blessing in the lives of others. Let me leave you with this quote This is from the sociologist I opened up with. He says, most of us are inclined to what's been called the great man or the great person view of history, that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. The only problem with this perspective is that it's mostly wrong. Against this great man view of history and culture, I would argue, along with many others, that the key actor in history is not the individual genius, but rather the network. Are you the kind of person who wants to make a difference in the lives of others, but you think, I'm just an ordinary person, I'm not some individual genius? Well, let this be a comfort to you. History has not turned on individual genius, but rather a network of people working together collaboratively to accomplish a common purpose. And if this is you, I would encourage you to join in. If you're already investing with Joe, this is what you're involved in, but he can give you a lot more information about ways to get involved here. So with that, I'll welcome Joe back on, and we are now going to just enter into a time of Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, again, you can use the Q&A box to type a question in, and we will do our best to get to that. So we do have a couple of questions, pretty common ones. The first one is, how does all of this affect performance? That's the gist of it here. What you described sounds very exciting. It sounds a bit like philanthropy, not investing. So how does all of this affect the bottom line? Investing for the purpose of growing my money, while I appreciate the values-based investing message. This is a very common perception. Many of us, we tend to view things like philanthropy as getting no return, but a high impact on the world. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have investing, right? Which is about getting a return with very little impact on the world. And we think that what I just described here sounds somewhere in between, perhaps leaning more toward the philanthropy side. And so do you have to give up anything by way of a return there? I do think that there's a way to practice this in which you do accept a lower rate of return. That's not the way that my firm approaches it. Every investment we make has to be as compelling for the story as it is for the return potential in our estimation. I could have just as easily given you the financial rationale for each of the three examples that I gave. And you can see this, for example, in the schizophrenia medicine. You have 3 million Americans alone who need this treatment. And so you have a defined market there ready to receive that medicine, which oftentimes will be paid for by healthcare providers. So there's definitely a way to do this where you are aiming at two targets at the same time, which is financial return as well as the social impact. So if you have further questions about that, I know Joe could probably provide some data and point you in the right direction. Anything you'd add there, Joe?
I'd invite people to go to your company's website, to eventidefunds.com. And if they're concerned about performance, I think they'll find some really interesting stats there.
Great. Another question here, this is a little bit of an unusual one, but it said, back when I was talking about Facebook and Netflix and Twitter and Google, I made the case that those companies only exist because of investors. So just asking for a little bit of a clarification there. So this is a really important point. It's a new way of thinking, but companies do not issue stocks and bonds so that we can save for retirement. There is absolutely no altruistic motive there on the part of companies. Why do they issue stocks and bonds? It is so that they can get the capital that they need to grow their businesses. Now, in order to get that capital from investors, they have to offer something in return, which is a share in the upside potential of the business. We tend to see the purpose of investing as getting money, and certainly that's a part of the deal. But the purpose of investing is actually to supply capital to businesses. And so at one point, all of those companies from Silicon Valley, they were struggling and they needed capital. And so if investors had not come along, they would not exist today. They would just be a footnote in history. And this is the case with investing throughout history. Every company, including my own, there was a point in time where we simply couldn't exist without people infusing capital into the business to help us grow. So when you invest, you are certainly investing to get access to that return stream, but you also need to think about what your money is accomplishing and how you are, in every investment decision, actually making decisions about what you want the world to look like, that your capital is actually assisting businesses to enlarge their influence in the world. This is the way in which investing has this power, is that you're shaping the world through the kinds of investment decisions you make. And this is exciting, I think, because there's a connection between how we use our money and the way in which the world will look in the future, and what kind of world we want to create for both our own family as well as for the lives of our neighbors. So this whole presentation was intended to help key you in on that relationship between your investment decisions and the shape of the world around us. Anything you would add to that, Joe?
No, it's actually exciting though to see when you see a company take off or an idea take off that is making such a positive difference. The profit side of it is nice, but you've known you've actually made that difference, and you did it with your dollars. It's rewarding on more levels than one. The graphic that you had up, where you pulled out some of the ideas for investing and some of the key focuses, those are also available on the website, and I find them really interesting. They're things I haven't thought of before. And when we've gone and dug in really deep to the individual companies and the individual investments, it's definitely a different mindset. Like you say, your advocacy role really comes into play. And there's some investments that are more mainstream, but then the reason behind them was very different. So it's not things that you're finding in the media. Some of the more focused investments that would have been pretty much undiscovered investments in the past, or being an early investor in those, funding them to get them off the ground, has made a difference for those companies. And again, I think the schizophrenia drug was that type of investment again, right? It was an early investment.
Yep.
Rather than a publicly traded phenomenon type thing. It wasn't in the news. So I find it interesting. So we're over a little bit tonight. No, there's a few questions. I'll reach out to some of those questions and tomorrow and send an email for those we didn't get to. But I'd also like to offer, for those of you that are not yet a client, a second opinion on your portfolios, or if you'd like to learn how to align your investments more closely with your values, or if you'd like to find out more about Eventide's investment process or what we do. We're a holistic financial planning firm, not just the investments, but it's aligning your goals, reducing your taxes, and providing a lifestyle for you later that you're comfortable with. And we also have, don't forget, the drawing for the mugs. We have quite a few, not enough to go all the way around, so we will be doing a drawing. And if you've won, we'll let you know tomorrow by email. And we're going to be sending out a recording of this session. I believe it'll go out on Saturday. If you'd like to share it with someone, family members or friends who you think would find it interesting, please do so. Watch for that. Again, that'll be on Saturday morning. And you just never know when a few words or a single idea can change someone's life for the better. So that's the reason you should be sharing that. And thanks, Jason. You did a great job. I love the topic. And thanks for being here again. And I look forward to connecting with everyone out there. Take care. Thank you.